Great. Welcome everyone to panel 4 about what can business and government do to protect migrant workers. And I'm very thankful to the organizers that we do have a dedicated panel on migrant workers. And I'll start off talking a little bit about why we should care specifically about migrant workers when we talk about global supply chains and human rights. And then, of course, I have an excellent panel that I will bring in to talk about it from their perspectives. But why do we care about migrants specifically when we're talking about business and human rights? And migration really is currently a growth business. Every year we have more migrants globally on the move for a variety of reasons. If we look at specifically Asia and the Pacific, we had in 2020 about 115 million migrants from this region, and most of them actually migrated within the region. For a myriad of reasons, some of them are forced migrants, people fleeing conflict, but you have also many labor migrants, you have students, you have families going with the breadwinner. And regardless really for why migrants move or migrate, you can be sure that they end up in your supply chains in one way or another. Because in all situations, people need to work, whether they are refugees, whether they're migrants, whether they're students. And quite regularly we see that while you have sort of regular labor pathways that allow regular migration, many end up doing so irregularly. It's difficult to access those regular pathways. And then they may end up in situations of heightened vulnerability where they don't have protections, where they cannot turn to their governments asking for assistance where something goes wrong. Also, if you look at students, for example, they may go as students but then work on the side, and that is not necessarily permitted, and that creates additional vulnerability. The future of migration in Asia also looks very much to be on the increase for a whole host of reasons, but the main ones probably can be named as demographic shifts in the region. So we have aging populations and we have youth bulges, and these will be moving from one to the other to support with the economies, to support with development. Climate change is going to be is already, but increasingly going to be a huge driver of migration, often quite vulnerable. Also, the tech transformation that will change the nature of work, and often in quite unpredictable ways, where perhaps areas of work that were labor heavy and employed a lot of migrant workers will no longer do so. And those migrants will need to suddenly go into new areas, into new countries to find work. And so a lot of this mobility that's going to be on the increase will also be unpredictable and not have access to regular pathways that take usually a long time to establish between government actors to make sure that they're well regulated. And so we will have much more sort of unpredictable and vulnerable migration. Migration also happens in corridors, so it's not that each country gets an equal amount of migrants, but there are specific labor migration mobility corridors that we see. And these are often based on, of course, on the actual need, both in the host country and the country of destination, but also in cultural preferences, on religious practices, on proximity, a whole host of reasons why certain countries supply migrants to other countries. The main corridors in our region, just to name a few, is really from South Asia to the Gulf Cooperation countries. And we had, I think, again in 2020, we had 22 million South Asian migrants who went to the Gulf Cooperation countries. So these are huge flows of migrants that we're talking about. The Greater Mekong region tends to send its labor migrants mostly to Thailand and Malaysia. The Philippines is a very large migrant-sending country, and that goes predominantly to the Gulf Cooperation countries again, but also really everywhere in the world, from Europe to Malaysia to elsewhere. And then finally, the Pacific mostly sends its labor migrants to Australia and New Zealand, and that's a very specific corridor there. And in all of this movement, it's good to remember that migrant workers are 3 times more vulnerable to exploitation than the national workforce. So where you have migrant labor in your supply chain, and probably you do, you will also have people who are very vulnerable to exploitation. And there are some structural and systemic reasons for this. And really it starts with recruitment, and that's something that I haven't heard talk about a lot today, but recruitment fees and costs are usually very high, and migrants can pay up to $10,000 to access a regular labor pathway. So doing everything right, being regulated by the government, but they still end up paying these costs. And once you pay such high costs to access employment, it means that the first few years of your employment are probably in bonded labor. It's debt bondage because most often you will be in minimum wage kind of a employment situation. There are contracting issues. Often we see contracts not being issued in the right languages. Contracts are being substituted. The migrants don't have the understanding nor really the right to question the kind of contracts that they're being given. And of course, that also stems from language barriers where the contract may not be in the correct language that the migrant speaks, or the migrant doesn't speak the language of the middle management or the management in the company that they end up in. And so whatever issues they may have or want to discuss, they actually can't. Usually there are access to justice issues, whether that's cost of justice, cost of representation, or the time that it takes for justice to happen. So even if something goes wrong, if there's exploitation at the workplace, it's not in the migrants' interest to complain about it because they know they won't be able to get justice for that complaint. One of the biggest issues, though, is the use of immigration laws to govern migration rather than the use of labor laws. So where national workforce really comes under labor issues, labor policies, labor laws, they can access labor tribunals. Immigration acts are usually used to govern migrants. So if a migrant complains about the employer, for example, a very likely scenario is that the employer may terminate the contract, and then the migrant will have X number of days to leave the country. So whatever case you would have had in the country to ask for your rights, you cannot represent yourself in the country, and cross-border justice is not really very present yet, although we see some promising practices here. So what can we do in this space then? The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that are almost 25 years old were a great start, I think, to really start talking about the role of the business in protecting human rights and for this panel, the rights of migrant workers in the supply chain. And what was really great about that was that it articulated a relationship between the governments and the business. So this isn't just for the governments in terms of creating a enabling policy environment to protect human rights, or it isn't just about the business in terms of identifying labor rights issues and then remedying them, but it is really doing this jointly, whether it's through the protect, the respect, or the remedy pillar. And we've seen, and this was mentioned by the previous panel as well, we've seen quite a lot of work by the private sector now addressing the labor supply chain issues. We've seen even increasing work on remedy, which is often the missing pillar. So going much beyond just understanding that you may have some systemic human rights issues in your supply chain, but also really working towards remedy. And some of the great practices that we've seen, for example, is several larger companies repaying recruitment costs where they've identified them. So actually trying to understand exactly how much the migrant workers paid to get into their supply chain and then repaying that cost to make sure that there's no bonded labor in the supply chain. And the governments do tend to have fairly decent legislations in place, although sometimes still in this region in particular, implementation of those rules and legislations can be a challenge. But one of the missing spaces that we do still see is how does the private sector, how do the businesses talk to the government? How do they do this jointly so that it's not one sector doing it in a corner and then the government doing something else, but that there's constant dialogue and collective action. And beyond GABF, which is a really nice forum for bringing the business and the governments together, we haven't seen a lot of these kind of platforms available yet. So some of the areas that we see where both the private sector and the governments are working on, but not necessarily always together, include remedy, so access to justice. Private sector does a lot in terms of having internal grievance mechanisms, identifying issues. But when the issues are systemic, like the payment of recruitment costs and fees, it takes a government counterpart to say we need to do something systemic to address this. It's not just for the private sector to keep on repaying them. We see a lot of good work going on human rights due diligence, focusing on migrant workers, and also increasing the worker voice in these processes. One of the challenges for workers is that migrant workers is that they cannot join unions in most countries. So that idea of collective representation coming together and advocating for yourself is usually not available for migrant workers. But there's quite a lot of sort of ancillary action, whether it's through civil society or migrant organizations that's bringing that up, and the private sector is adopting it. And the government, on the other hand, is looking at how they can engage migrant workers to, for example, assess whether the policies are fit for purpose. We see Pre-departure training. Usually pre-departure training is done by governments, but the private sector is taking an increasing interest in making sure that the pre-departure trainings are meeting their needs, whether that's language, cultural skills, just understanding what the migrants are coming to, and also then thinking about the full cycle of migration, so going to return and reintegration. So what is the private sector's responsibility in terms of preparing the migrant for returning to their country of origin? Ultimately, most migrants will go home because they don't have permanent residency access. They cannot naturalize into the countries where they've stayed and worked. And so thinking about what does that return look like is also something that's really important from both governments and private sector side. And then, of course, promoting ethical recruitment and the employer pays principles to make sure that we get rid of the payment of recruitment fees and costs that are really the kind of original sin for bonded labor. So to discuss these issues, I have a great panel with me today, which can look at this from all the three elements. So really, what is in it for the migrant worker? What are the challenges there? How does the business look at it? And what are governments doing right now to look at this further? And so to start us all off, I would like to ask Mahendra Pandey, who is a former migrant worker himself, and really has built 15 years of human rights work stemming from that experience that looks at counter-trafficking work, how to organize workers, and survival leadership. And so Mahendra, if you could start us off by talking a little bit about continued challenges that the migrant workers that you work with face in the workplace, the gaps in the support, and what you're doing particularly through sort of worker voice and worker representation to address that.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for Government and Business Forum for giving opportunity to speak directly from the migrant worker voice. And me representing here, I'm not representing alone. I'm representing the spirit of millions of migrant workers, and I'm one of them because I was also migrant workers in Saudi Arabia, and my dad was also migrant workers for 14 years, and my younger brother, he's still migrant workers. It means whole part of my family and part of the migration cycles. And I cannot, describe everything today, but I can describe what is the, challenges and gaps looks like. When I was a migrant worker and when I left Nepal to Saudi Arabia, at that times, I also paid huge recruitment fee. There was no other choice, and also I didn't have any education and awareness. I could go without paying recruitment fee. And still there are many discussions around the world by many civil society organizations, UN agency and government, ethical recruitment agency, responsible recruitment agency, employer pay recruitment agency. But very few migrant workers, they have access, they have options, and they have awareness about this. And 10 years ago, I didn't have any awareness. But right now, many migrant workers, they have understanding that they shouldn't pay the recruitment fee. But still, many migrant workers, they are forced to pay because they don't have options. And they don't have any alternative. And even though there are policy and there are mechanisms, those policy and mechanisms are not implemented well. And that's why many migrant workers, they are demanding, we are not looking for the written law, we are looking for the implemented law that can have impact in our life. That is one thing. And then second thing, in terms of challenges of the migrant worker situations, particularly many migrant workers, especially from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Africa and West Africa, they go to the Middle East and the Gulf to work. And many Gulf countries, they don't allow migrant workers to join a union or organize or part of representations. If you don't have representations, you don't have voice. If you are not in the table, you cannot share your story. And if you cannot share a story, and whatever policy, whatever recommendations you make, that would be only one-sided. Either like, those story and those perception captured by certain type of civil society organizations or government and businesses. If you want to look the whole cycle and whole comprehensive part of the solution of the solution of migrations, you must listen the story of migrant worker. You must listen their perspective, and migrant worker need to be part of the decision making table. And sometimes we often hear that businesses and government people, there is a stereotype. If we invite migrant workers or survivor, they always share sad story and bad story. That is not always true, because sad story and bad story, why they share? Because that is their life. Life has been like that. And what else they can share? If they have a best practices, if they have a best experience, if they have a wonderful experience, they would share wonderful experience. Whatever experience they have, they will share like that. And there is a stereotype that if we invite them, they will share bad story, sad story. In whole conference, whole forum will be, will go as the different directions, and there will be emotions, there will be tears. And if we cannot tolerate, and if we cannot hear those emotions, and if we cannot respect those kind of feelings, then we cannot respect the migrant workers. If you want to respect the migrant workers, if you want to respect, if you want to hear their perspective, if you want to include them part of the solution, you must listen their story. You shouldn't scare with the bad story and sad story. Rather, sometimes migrant workers, they can be also part of the wonderful idea and wonderful solutions they can provide. And one of your questions, what we have been doing in order to mitigate this. When I was a migrant workers, there were not that many organizations, but there are these days there are many organizations. And particularly with the Global Migrant Worker Network, we started from 25 individual migrant workers. Right now, we have 18,000 migrant workers from Asia, Africa, and be part of this network, and 71 worker-led organizations. They are demanding not only for the charity, advocacy, or awareness, and to be leader of the future-led migrations in next 5 years or next 10 years. So if you look at the Global Migrant Worker Network leaderships, they are very talented and small leaders. They can provide best solution for the businesses and government people. And now they are looking for not only charitable purposes, and also them to lead the many sectors. And one of the discussions just few days ago we had, and the migrant worker leaders, they told me that leadership is not what you do and what you are. Leadership is what you act. And that's why I would like to also use their phrase to the forum of the business and government forum in the Bali process in Sri Lanka. If we are talking about the leadership, we are not talking about what kind of leaderships we should have, and we are talking about what the leaders act and what kind of leaders they will act on behalf of migrant workers or behalf of community and behalf of survivors. So those kind of things we have been observing, and I see there are many gaps and many challenges in terms of migrant worker protections and migrant workers inclusions and migrant workers not the part of the many discussions, many policy, many decision making process. So if you want to have a comprehensive solutions, and we need to include them, we need to listen them. If we listen them, then we can respect also them. And I hope in the next business forum, we can see many migrant workers and many survivors, and we can hear directly from them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And not just at the next business forum, but at all forums where these issues are being discussed. And I really like the way that you say, migrants have empowering stories and solutions. And that's why we want to engage migrants, because they will have solutions to their own problems. And we should really be listening. But thank you, and we'll come back with more questions later. But next I would like to turn on to Ruan from MAS Intimates, which is the largest exporter in Sri Lanka, and you have operations in many different countries, and you also employ migrant workers. So it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about the work that your company takes to ensure there is no exploitation in your supply chain, and also how can you engage with your host governments on some of these issues?
Right. Thank you. First of all, let me thank Chairman of CMG, Mr. Sirasa Mahendran, and my dear friend Shivan for giving us this opportunity, as Dr. Forrest said, to showcase how a small country like Sri Lanka can push the bar of the ethical manufacturing to the next level, and letting us to learn from the best. We are an apparel organization, and I do have a presentation to run. And when you say apparel manufacturing, which is garment manufacturing, so the first picture which comes into your mind is totally different, which is this. So, but what you all need to understand is, yes, there are few or some who still work like this. But there are many who is going north of this as we speak now. And when you go into the apparel industry historically, unfortunately, this is an industry which is following the cheap labor, which was started in US, moved into Europe and US, and then moved into East Africa, East Asia, South Asia, and now we are moving into East Africa and to Central America looking for cheap labor. So that is the looking for cheap labor causing labor issues. So if I talk about my organization, which I am working for, we have a pretty young organization, just 38 years old, a family-owned company. And, but we do have 118,000 team members working for us as we speak today in 17 countries. And most importantly, 72% of that 118,000 are female. So who are more vulnerable to the exploitation and migration. So when there's cheap labor forcing you to go into places where there is the labor available, there are two issues which would happen. Number one, labor migration and labor exploitation. So what I'm going to tell, as Pepe said, what have we done as MAs in overcoming these two main issues? So when it comes to migration of labor, we have found out three different types of labor migration. One, international labor migration. And one thing we forget is there's a domestic labor migration also within the country. So if you take a country like Bangladesh, where we are in Indonesia, people are moving from their homes to like 500 miles away, and they go only once a year back home. It's almost like international migration. And then we have Sri Lankan expatriation, whom we are sending as middle managers to our overseas location. That's also an issue for us. And if I talk about labor migration, so first of all, the international labor migration, one good example where we have is Jordan, where we have a lot of Nepalis, Bangladeshis, and Sri Lankan, Indian, and working in our facilities. So biggest issue we have in there is recruitment agencies. So the recruitment agencies exploit these people. They charge abnormal prices, and they ask for unnecessary tests like pregnancy test and many other tests. And at the end, those people sometimes end up trafficking child labor also. So what have we done as MAs? So we are working with certified few job agencies, and we have a very strict compliance and audit standard, which this agent has to comply, and we do have a quarterly audit process. And there's zero fee from the employees. So whatever the cost we pay, and there's an onboarding, we do the final interview, and there's an onboarding before which is pre-departure induction, and once they arrive into Jordan, we do another induction. So that's through that we have successfully able to minimize or make it zero this migration issue and the exploitation issue. And the second one is migration within the country. So actually this is more visible in the countries where there is high unemployment. There are people who call them as manpower agencies, and they rent you the people. I'm just saying the word they use. They're renting you the people. Why the manufacturers like us go for this rent labor? Because there's a fluctuation in demand, and you don't need to have you are scared of having permanent cadre, so you recruit 100 today and pay tomorrow, and there's no demand, and you just take them off. The problem with that is these employees are getting a very small fraction of what the organizations pays to these agencies. It's only about 40% goes back to the employee. So our policy, we don't deal with any recruitment agency. We are directly recruiting in all 17 countries what we are operating at. And then Sri Lankan expatriation, if you go to Bangladesh, majority of the middle management in apparel industry, which is a big one, $45 billion industry in Bangladesh, are Sri Lankan or Indians. If you go to Kenya, it is the same, Sri Lankan or Indian. So why? Because the base country is continue to send the middle management to the country where you're operating if it is outside your base country. So it is up to us to make sure that we develop the middle management from the country itself. I was telling Rina yesterday when we spoke, one of the best countries we have seen out of our 17 countries is Indonesia, because the most progressive middle management female cadre we have is in Indonesia, in Central Java actually, to be specific. And in most of the countries, more than 50% of the middle management is in-house, in the sense from the native country. That we have made sure. So that's about the migration. And then the next problem for people like us, if you go behind the cheap labor, is exploitation. So what we have for that is a standard called 1MS. And first thing we believe, the best way of minimizing the exploitation is awareness, empowerment, and knowledge building. Without that, you cannot if you don't educate these people, they will not know, at least to start with, what exactly the exploitation is. You first have to teach them this is exploitation. If they don't know what exactly the exploitation, they will just continue to live that life without knowing they've been exploited. So that's what we do. So we have two different programs, one called Women Go Beyond, which we have started 21 years ago. And we are enhancing the skills, empowering our associates, we call them team members, and developing their awareness. And for the last 21 years, we have touched more than 5 million lives in that program. And we have started another program in 2020, 4 years back, called PACE, Personal Advancement and Career Development Program, funded, shared by two of our big customers, again on the same principle. So why? We need our team members, the operators who are sitting or standing in front of a machine, to understand what they do, and if they leave this job, to make sure that they can find another way of life. And then about domestic geographical migration. So in Sri Lanka, I'm taking the Sri Lankan example because we are majority, 70% is in Sri Lanka. And we have two big zones, one in Katunayaka and one in Biyagama, the free trade zone. So most of manufacturers would like to go into the free trade zone because infrastructure is available, captive labor is available, and the rules and regulations are flexible. Actually, we went south. 70% of our factories are out of these two zones. Why? We want our people to work and go back home. And we provide transportation around 60 kilometers radius to every single employee we have, entire 118,000. So that makes sure that they have a better life in their family when they go back home. So that's the second step what we have taken. And the third step is all these accreditation and the approvals we have. So we have human and compliance standard. Most of the things which are available in the world, in all the 17 countries, whether we are in Haiti, Honduras, Indonesia, or Bangladesh, it's a similar standard we follow. And our rule is higher of law of the land or this standard has to be applied. But to be frank, unfortunately, we have not found none of these 17 countries has a better standard than any corporate standard. That is something all of us has to think and work for. If a government can meet a corporate standard, then the things will be legalized. And you see, this is a voluntary standard. We are complying and we do it on our own at our will. But if there's a law, people who are not currently doing might start doing it. So if I go back to this cheap labor conversation, which is it's a myth, right? So what's actually the true cost? So 70%, of course, 70% of our overhead is labor. But it is only 25% of the FOB price is labor. You have raw material, you have investment depreciation, and a lot of other things. And only 6 to 7% of the retail price is labor. So why are we only trying to squeeze this 7%? There's 75% of FOB to be squeezed and good 93% of retail price to be squeezed. Unfortunately, we don't see it because easy thing to see is people and number of heads you have and cut it down and exploit as much as you can. And in the supply chain discussion, INSAF of ILO said, I quote, better working condition, but not at the cost of the profit. So that's what we believe as MAs. It is true, it is possible. So how can we do that? You make happier team, and when you have a happier team, your quality is good, your productivity is high. When your quality is good, your demand is high, your revenue is high. And when your productivity is good, it will definitely more than offset the premium you are paying for your people. So it's a possible equation. And to end, I agree about what Dr. Forrest said. It's all about leadership. But it's the passion a leadership is having to make an impact and create a difference in this world and with the people we are working. So there is a possibility of making a win-win equation if the leaders think and see it correctly. That's what we do at MS.
Thank you so much. And it was really wonderful to hear that you comply by the employer pays principles and you do pre-departure orientation. Those are some great practices. But just fair warning, I'm going to ask you about the business case later. And also, it was interesting, the mention about the standards, that your standards that you comply by are now higher than most of the standards of the governments where your factories are in. And what is the space for having a dialogue around that? But with that, we're going to move on to our government representative. So we have Rina from the government of Indonesia with 20 years of experience in human rights and economic development. In her current work, assisting migrant workers and doing human rights advocacy. So given that Indonesian government, Indonesian migrants are everywhere in the world, and you do end up doing quite a lot of work assisting returning migrants and migrants in situations of vulnerability. Can you tell us a little bit about your work in terms of the assistance that is provided, some of the challenges that you face, and also where you see the cooperation or collaboration opportunities with the private sector in this?
Thank you so much, Pepi. And I'm very happy to be here in a panel together with Mr. Ruan and also Mr. Mahendra, who definitely have quite extensive experience, of course, in terms of protecting workers. So thanks again for the introduction. I'm with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I work for the Directorate for Citizen Protection. So basically, there's a unit dedicated only to protect Indonesian nationals overseas, including migrant workers under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I don't know about any other Ministry of Foreign Affairs in any other countries, but we do have that directorate. So basically what I'm going to share today, this afternoon, is mostly coming from my experience working both in the front line in Indonesian missions overseas and also within the MOFA, where we deal mostly with overseeing cases. Me, myself, working for the Southeast Asia region, so my cases mostly coming from Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Myanmar regarding online scam cases, trafficking in persons, and so on and so forth. So I'm happy to be here. Basically, based on our data, we currently have over 2 million Indonesian overseas, 74% of which are migrant workers. So they're mostly work in Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, and Hong Kong. So this is the data that we have in 2023 about the cases that we've been handling. So this is to give to give you sort of a figure or understanding on the gravity of the case that we are handling in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At least we have facilitated over 47,000 cases ranging from labor issues, anything, trafficking in persons, death penalty. Also, we facilitate return of financial rights through negotiating settlements. So given the nature of diplomatic relations, we work within the framework, within the scope of diplomatic and international relations stated in Vienna Conventions, which is that we need to comply with and uphold with national rules and regulations of the host country. So this is why protecting our citizens, protecting our nationals overseas is sometimes really difficult, because we kind of need flexibility in doing that, but not many countries has sort of mechanism to protect foreigners. So most of the time we have to negotiate the way to protect our nationals with the host countries, such as, you know, negotiating the settlements or allowing, you know, our citizens to have the access to consular, and then also try to negotiate, for example, with the host country to sort of allowing our citizens to break the rule a little bit regarding private regulation, for example, Privacy Act, if we need to access and get some information from them, etc., and including in case of trafficking in person, we often ask the local immigration to waive overstay fine caused by they overstay during becoming the victim of trafficking. So so as we can see, the role of the government in the context of migration has to cover everything from pre-migration to return and reintegration, including education, raising awareness, ensuring migrant workers have fulfilled the requirements for safe migrations, collaboration and partnership, and ensuring active participation of all parties to uphold and protect migrant workers' rights, and also regular monitoring and evaluation on the program for safe migration. So in terms of what business can do, of course, we would also like to encourage business to involve in all migration cycles as well. We need to streamlining the support from private sector in all migration cycles, from pre-migration, on-site, and post-migration. I agree with what Mr. Mahendra have mentioned, that in order to be able to provide service and correct regulations for the migrants and migrant workers, we need to listen to them. So that's what we do in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, especially in our directorate. We hear them, we understand the problem. We try to address the root cause of why they're migrating in the first place, because otherwise, if we don't understand, you know, why they're migrating in the first place, by the time they return, we doesn't have like a correct formula to ensure that the reintegration process is stable and providing a better living for them, because not only in Indonesia, in some cases, the push factor is not only economy. Sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it's social. So we need to address them, and we need to custom tailor the program of reintegration that best for them. And that's where we need also business to jump in this process, because I think business has, in some certain level, business has more access to finance, business has more network, business has more ability to set up, program or projects that can ensure that the reintegration for migrant workers can be done quite nicely. So with all of that, I think from this morning, we know from previous session that in pre-migration there are discussion on ethical and fair recruitment, and during the placement there are efforts to promote due diligence, ensuring supply chain free from trafficking or exploitation. In post-migration, we also discuss how business can also contribute in capacity building, rehabilitation, and support, as I mentioned before, to those who already came back to their home country. So last year, our president, this is a best practice. Last year, our president passed on a presidential decree on business and human rights, number 60, year 2023, which is basically break down what business should do to uphold human rights. Currently, if I'm not mistaken, we already launched a tool to identify risk of human rights violation within supply chain. So this is already, we call the tool Prisma. So we already launched Prisma 2.0. And we encourage businesses in Indonesia to comply with this tool, and to use this tool to ensure that they can promote and uphold human rights. So the challenge is actually, from our perspective, is how to encourage a business to do more than what they can do within their business. For example, well, because most of Indonesian nationals, migrant workers who became a victim overseas, is being hired by, a small company. Sometimes they work as the domestic workers. So what we need to do, collaborate with private sectors is beyond the business. I mean, like Mr. Ruan already mentioned that the company that he's working with is ensure the due diligence and the supply chains free from exploitation, etc. But how we can encourage business to contribute broader than the targeted workers under their management, how they can contribute more than their direct employee, for example. So that's why in our experience, we already engage with some businesses and private sectors. For example, in this picture, in Kuala Lumpur, we work together with a company, and under their social corporate responsibility program, they funded a safe house and also funded the operational costs of that safe house, so that our migrant workers who needs to be protected, for example, they have problems with their employer, and then there's some negotiations going on the compensation and so on and so forth, they can stay in the safe house funded by OCB. I think it's a bank. I forgot, OCBC or other bank, but it's definitely a financial bank. So, with that regard, I would like to again encourage business to contribute broader than within their own framework and their own company. That's all from me. Thank you, Pepi.
Thank you so much, Rina. And thanks also for raising the issue of domestic workers, because that doesn't really often get addressed. But actually, the most vulnerable are usually the domestic workers, because they don't even have that working environment that can protect them to some extent. And actually, we do have some examples of getting larger businesses to agree to a code of conduct, for example, in their private lives, so that when they do employ domestic workers, that they also agree to abide by certain standards, which helps with the protection of domestic workers. But I'm going to ask another round of quick questions, but I would like to open it to the floor as well, to the audience. So take a few minutes to think about questions that you'd want to ask, and then we can come to you. So getting back to the panel, I'm wondering, Mahendra, if you could give us some because ensuring migrant worker representation is that it's representative can be quite difficult, because a lot of the governments countries where the migrant workers are based don't really encourage social organization, collective bargaining, all of these issues, approaches that would allow you to kind of formally organize migrant workers. So can you give us some examples of how you work with the migrant workers to strengthen their ability to advocate for themselves and, to be ready to be at the table, to be representative? And yeah, would be good to hear.
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you both for wonderful insight and great learning. And every day is new learning, and I have learned so much from both of you. And today we are talking about modern day slavery. And one thing we should also remind ourselves is still many migrant workers, especially in Middle East and Gulf, they cannot keep their passport within themselves. So once they are landed in those countries, their passport will be controlled by the employer, and they cannot change the job, and they cannot relocate. And if some emergency happen back home, and they cannot fly without employer permissions. What that means, during the 16th century, people, they used to control and they used to make people slave with the collar iron chain. And these days, people, they are controlling with the passport. And we are talking about human rights. We are talking about freedoms. And if we cannot hold passports within us, and what kind of freedom we are talking about? And sometimes, freedom would be just name if we are not truly free, or if we are not truly freedoms. And one of the reasons we wanted to, create this global migrant worker network, not other than, just to have a voice for migrant workers, and for migrant workers, and by migrant workers. So we are invited by many organizations, including government, business, civil society organizations, to raise our voice. But sometimes, we don't feel that is always our platforms. Sometimes, migrant workers, they have many suffering, many pain, many mental health issue and well-being issue, and they find, themselves, feel comfortable sharing within the groups. And one of the slogans we created for the Global Migrant Worker Network, you are one of us. It means, you are not alone. And you don't have to think alone, and we are doing together. If we fail, we fail together. If we win, and we will win together. So that was the main reason. And if one person raising voice, that won't be sufficient, that won't be enough. If thousands of migrant workers, they are raising voice, and it would be at least, significant. That is the reasons, we wanted to include more migrant workers, and within the migrant workers, we have 69% migrant workers are women migrant workers, mainly, domestic workers from those countries. And we have 19 leadership circles. Among 19, 13 members are women migrant workers. And what that means, women migrant workers, particularly domestic workers, they are left behind from the many discussions, including policy discussions. And if you want to include women migrant worker in the panel or any kind of conference, we always get excuse. Oh, it's very hard to find domestic workers. Oh, employer, they will not let the domestic worker fly to Geneva, fly to New York, or fly to Bangkok, or Sri Lanka, or Kathmandu. That's just excuse. And if you try, you can get many domestic workers, many women migrant workers. And within 18,000 migrant workers, if 69% can be the domestic workers, if they can fly and they can represent, why cannot, other organizations and other peoples, they can do same thing? That's why we don't need just, participation. Sometimes participation means, you go in the conference, you listen, and you don't have voice, you don't have, platform to raise your voice. We are looking for representation. There is a, significant difference between participation and representations. In representations, you can raise your voice, you can raise your concerns. In participations, that is not the necessary case. So, and one more thing, I would like to mention here. We talk about, migrant workers and migration issue. There is no such a country in the world. If there is no migrant workers, those countries won't be survived. For example, in Qatar, 90% of the total population of Qatar are migrant workers. Same thing in Kuwait, around 80%. And in many countries, if migrant workers, they don't contribute, or if they leave their home country, it's very hard to believe that, those countries will survive. Not only country of destinations, country of origin as well. Majority of the economy is now, being covered by the remittances. When we talk about remittances, we should not forget about those remittances is contributed by the migrant workers. If you look at an example of my home country, 23% GDP is contributed by the migrant workers. I am from the country of Mount Everest. We have we talk about tourism. And migrant worker contributions in the national economy higher than tourism's. But if you look the exploitations, and if you look the trauma of migrant workers, way more higher. And just yesterday, I was visiting with one of the family member of the migrant workers, and she works in Jordan, and her family, daughters and grandkids, and they live here. And she told me that, when we migrate the country of destinations, we always migrate with good faith and healthy mind. But when we return back with exploitations. We return back with the trauma. Why that happen? Why we cannot return as we enter the country with a healthy mind and healthy faith and good faith? And that's why, I would like to request all of you in this room, and when each of you leave this event and return to your work or return to your home country, one thing I humbly request that you trust migrant workers, you trust survivor, you trust us, because we are also human beings. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mahendra. I think we hear your ask, and I feel a bit chastised as well with regards to representation in the various panels that I've attended. But quickly over to you, Ruan. So I wanted to ask you, because the ethical recruitment, the employer pays principle is something that IOM also advocates very strongly. And one of the arguments that we often get is that there's no business case for it, that it increases the cost of the goods too much when you start paying for the cost of recruitment. And so can you just talk us through a little bit your business case without giving too much away? But who pays then if the migrant doesn't pay? Does the consumer pay?
At the end, yes. But at the outset, in reality, the money from the bank is from the organization, that is from us. So as I said, we have a very robust mechanism of filtering these job agents. And before they sign up with us, we do the compliance and the compliance audit, and they have to sign that. And then we go for this 3 months review. And in terms of the payment, say there's medical, there's government fees, there's insurance fees, and then the travel cost and everything. And other than the passport cost of the employee, the rest we pay back to the job agent. And they are not supposed to charge a single cent from the employees, and the passport cost also we pay back to the employee. If you ask, have we had any instances where any of the agents has taken the not a shortcut, or a long cut kind of a thing and charging people? Yes, of course there are. But if you find, and that agent is being terminated, and we publicize it. So as I agree with Mahendra, there is no point of having rules in the book if you don't practice and by your heart. So we seriously believe that, yes, in the supply chain panel also Serena said, the regulation has to come. But as I said, there's no point of having regulation if you don't have the right heart and right people to practice those things. That is what he also mentioned, and we also truly believe it. It's whatever system you are going to have, it cannot be 100% watertight. People are crafty. Well, I mean, and it was mentioned that it's a $250 billion industry. Dr. Forrest said $250 billion. When you have a $250 billion industry, and these people definitely are very smart of finding out ways of the laws. So whatever compliance we are going to do, you have to be at it, you have to check it, and if you find somebody, you have to terminate, and you have to publicize it. That's what we do.
Great, thank you. And then finally to Rina, and if you can keep your answer pretty short so that we can still go back to the audience. And sorry, I'm going to ask you a very complex question as well. But you identified spaces and areas where the private sector and the government could do more together around pre-migration, on-site, and post-migration. And we also hear from the private sector that they would like to talk to the government more around standards, around, if there are systemic issues that they cannot address just as the private sector, how to bring the government on board. But there aren't many platforms and places where those conversations can happen. And so what would you think or see the mechanism through which we could have somewhat more organized conversations at country level?
Well, for sure, GABAF is one of them. We need to encourage dialogues between government and business, for sure. And I think in Indonesia, especially after we passed the presidential decree last year on the national strategic for business and human rights, in Indonesia we already have the forum for dialogue between business and government, and also through platforms like this forum, for example, and through our government, we do encourage other ministry which work or job desk is to deal with business and ensuring due diligence of the companies, such as the Ministry of what do you call it? My mind goes blank. Ministry of Manpower. They also have a strategy to ensure that the manning agency comply with regulation on ethical and fair recruitment. So that's one of the platform that we can use.
Okay, thank you. And so I would like to turn to the audience just to see if there are any questions. And if not, I have run out of time as well. So very happy to end it here. So with that, thank you very much to the panelists and for the great exchange. It was very enjoyable. Thank you.